Ready. Play.
Hello, everybody. We are here to present to you a little show on the ATP Tour finals that are about to come up and how I see the 8 players that are going into that tournament in order of likelihood, I guess you could say, of winning it, or just who's better placed, let's say. There may be some surprises for you, some that you may agree with, some that you may disagree with. Make sure you let me know in the comments section below this video. Of course, we've just seen the conclusion of the WTA finals in Fort Worth, Texas. And congratulations to Caroline Garcia on her incredible run and victory last night over Aryna Sabalenka. But like I say, I'm here to talk to you about the way I see things with just 5 or 6 days now to go before those end-of-year men's ATP Tour finals get underway. So let's get going. Who do I see as the outsider, the person that is 8th on the list, if you like, in terms of how we're going to go into this tournament? Well, personally, I have Casper Ruud in at 8th place on the list. Some people might think it's a bit harsh. Obviously, US Open finalist. One of the reasons I think behind this, though, is that I think his form of late hasn't been great. I think he's 2-4 in his last 6 matches. I also think that perhaps his run to the final in Paris was a bit fortuitous. I'm talking about, obviously, Paris, Roland Garros. So perhaps his ranking has been somewhat aided by that, in that obviously clay court swing, useful. No points at Wimbledon, where obviously he's not likely to do quite so well, and he didn't do that well. So I think the scoring system this season has helped him a bit. I also think his run to the Paris final was a little bit fortuitous, in that Stefanos Tsitsipas, who was somewhat out of form at the time, went out reasonably early. Coffee, sip, break. Talking tennis mug. But yes, so he's 8th on my list. I also don't see him, the matchups and the head-to-heads to the 7 people that I have ahead of him isn't particularly strong for me. And listen, tournament wins this year. He's obviously won 3 titles. Those 3 titles, though, were never at a 1,000 or higher level, albeit that he did get, obviously, to the US Open final as well. I think he was very impressive in his win against Berrettini and is worthy of his place. But for the aforementioned reasons, I have him in 8th place. In 7th, I have Taylor Fritz. Of course, you might be saying, why not have Taylor Fritz in 8th place? He was sort of a lucky loser, if you like, in terms of this event, or it's obviously the wrong terminology, but you know what I mean, with obviously him getting in the 8th spot due to the absence of Carlos Alcaraz, who pulled out injured last week with some abdominal issues. Alcaraz will obviously now be resting up nicely ahead of the 2023 season. But yeah, Taylor Fritz, I mean, largely he gets in on the back of having the Masters 1000 title at Indian Wells this year, which is one of 3 titles that he won throughout the year, obviously winning quite recently as well in Tokyo, beating Francis Tiafoe in that final. But he did underwhelm at the US Open. I think his form is a bit patchy. I also think that the players ahead of him again, in particular when we get to the number 6 person in my list, I think the head-to-head there doesn't look too great for me. And I did see him in action last week in Paris against the retiring, as it was his retirement event, Gilles Simon. And I thought he was very flat and very disappointing, particularly at the crucial moments as it got towards the end of that 3rd set. So for me, he is number 7 on the list. He may yet make the semi-finals, but I would be surprised. But perhaps a favorable group may help the American. Now, I mentioned number 6 on my list. I've got number 6 as Rafael Nadal. 1 or 2 people might have him a bit higher. 22-time Grand Slam winner. But of course, only ever 1 indoor hard court title in his entire career, which spans the best part of 2 decades, would suggest that this isn't a favorable condition for him. He's obviously been a serial person at this event. Didn't make it last year through injury. I have him ahead of Taylor Fritz, though, partly because I think that an injured Rafa Nadal can still beat Taylor Fritz, as we saw at Wimbledon this year when he had basically no serve. I think Rafa really fancies his chances. Now, many of you might point to the Indian Wells final. Again, Rafa had injuries in that final and didn't play tennis for the next 4 or 5 weeks. And I think we saw Rafa looking particularly glum afterwards because he knew that final was there for him to win if only he was healthy. So I have Rafa at number 6. Of course, his form of late with back-to-back losses at the US Open against TFO and then also against Tommy Paul last week in Paris, when he looked pretty good for a set and a half, but ran out of gas certainly in the third, and Tommy Paul was a deserving winner. So I have Rafa Nadal in at number 6 on my list. Number 5, I have Andrey Rublev. I wasn't sure whether to put Rafa in at 5 or Rublev in at 5, but I've gone for the Russian. I think his form of late has actually not been too bad. Of course, he did lose last week in Paris-Bercy relatively early on against Holger-Rune, but of course, Holger-Rune, we all know, went on to win the title. And by the way, I do think some of these players ranked, say, 5 to 8 are probably quite relieved that the Dane isn't at this tournament, because I think he would be ruffling a few feathers and would probably be higher ranked than most of the players at this tournament, or certainly the latter 3 or 4 that we've already mentioned. Many people did, though, suggest his victory over John Isner was very impressive. He's pretty good on a hardcore indoor. He has got some pedigree. He was at the ATP Masters the ATP Tour Finals in the past. So listen, Andrey Rublev could quite easily, particularly with a favorable draw. A lot will change depending on how that draw pans out. We may see a group with Daniil, Medvedev and Djokovic and Nadal all in one group, and that would obviously change the dynamic somewhat. And then we may see Rublev, Casper, and Taylor in another group, and then suddenly Rublev's chances go up. But I've got I've got Andrey Rublev in at number 5 on my list. Let me know what you think about that. Certainly let us know. You can obviously follow us on Talking Tennis at Talking Tennis TT on Twitter. We're also on Facebook, and of course you can let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stefanos Tsitsipas. I think one thing about him, I've got him at number 4 in my list. I think this slight promotion, he may well have been a couple of places lower, but was very much based on his tournament last week in Paris, where he did make the semi-finals. Quite possibly could have beaten Novak Djokovic in the semi-finals, obviously in a third set tiebreaker where he was a mini breakup. For many people, one of the best indoor matches of the year, that particular matchup. And so he is just starting to find a bit of form after what was a largely disappointing summer, particularly in New York, going out in the first round. I know he divides opinion on whether he's had a good year or a bad year. I certainly fall into the bad year camp, but it's because I have such high expectations for him. He may yet end up year-end number 1, but it would be probably as bizarre, in my opinion, given the year he's had, as it would be to see somebody like Casper Ruud, who was obviously very close to doing so in New York. But yes, I do take a lot of stock in his week in Paris last week, beating Tommy Paul. I thought that was a really, really good win and perhaps a mini turning point for the Greek. But he can also take a lot of confidence from that match against Djokovic, though tight moment, big player, doesn't win. It can be a bit of a pattern for him at these moments, particularly against Novak. I guess no shame in that. But if he wants to win this tournament, he may well have to beat Novak to do so. Okay, moving on. Medvedev comes in for me at number 3 on my list. So I really think he has a great chance of making the semi-finals. Disappointing exit last week in Paris, losing out to de Minaur in his first match there in the French capital. Possibly if he'd had a better tournament, I may well have bumped him up another place higher. But I think that result, the way it happened, of course, smashing his racket at the end of the match there didn't look great. And yet the previous few weeks before that, we started to see the Daniil Medvedev of old. I remember the victory against Dominic Thiem in Vienna just recently, where he came off the court and said, listen, I won that match because I'm playing much, much better. The Daniil Medvedev of a few weeks before and largely throughout this year would not have done so well in Vienna. And I think it was a great win for him in the final. And also, of course, that match he had against Djokovic, which was nip and tuck until he retired through injury. But he is fit and he is firing, albeit that he slightly misfired in Paris, which makes me put him just one step lower down. But listen, his chances are much better now than they would have been a few weeks ago. Felix Auger-Aliassime comes in for me at number 2 on my list. I really think that he has been mightily impressive in recent weeks. Perhaps a little bit disappointing in that semi-final against Holger-Rune in Paris recently. But listen, if we look at his record prior to Paris, winning in Basel, winning in Antwerp, winning in Florence, 3 titles back-to-back, the first person to do that many, many years. I think perhaps he did just slightly run out of steam last week. And Holger-Rune, of course, playing fantastically in the capital. obviously. So that makes a big difference. We see Alcaraz there as well, that he beat in the semi-finals. Felix, this is just recently in Basel. So we remember that run that he had where he just didn't lose serve. So for me, at the moment, in terms of form, it's really nip and tuck between him and the person who I've put in first place in these power rankings as we head to Turin. I think the week off will do Felix a bit of good as well. It'll be good for him to just recharge those batteries, having barely had a break for the last month. Felix, therefore, goes in as my number 2 on my list. And unsurprisingly, Novak Djokovic. Do I really need to say anything? I mean, a multiple ATP Tour Finals winner in the past. He hasn't won it for a few years, admittedly, but his indoor hardcourt season since the minute he came back in Tel Aviv, where he just tore it up without losing a set, 250 tournament, admittedly, but he looked good. He then looked even better in Astana. And just look at that run to the title in Astana. Okay, Christian Garin, clay court specialist, you would argue, but nevertheless had to be beaten, and he did so with a loss of just 2 games. Then beating Botic, Khachanov, Daniil, Medvedev in the semis, albeit that Medvedev obviously retired through injury, and crushing Stefanos Tsitsipas in the finals. So it's been 2 wins in recent weeks against Tsitsipas, albeit one was much tighter than the other. I think it all bodes extremely well for Novak. And again, okay, he lost to Holger Rune in the final. Rune won't be there in Turin. This is also another level as well. So I just can't see anything past Novak being favorite. Doesn't necessarily mean he's going to win, but I think I would be shocked. Let me know in the live chat. Sorry, let me know in the chat below this video if anybody disagrees with my number one choice on this list. You can also let me know on Twitter. I've just posted this on Twitter to show you my 8 as I have it, with Casper Ruud in at number 8, Taylor Fritz at 7, Rafael Nadal at number 6, Andrey Rublev, Stefanos Tsitsipas, Daniil Medvedev, Felix in at number 2, and Novak Djokovic as my number 1 on my list. Let me know on Twitter. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you, Tennis World, for stopping by.